Yeah, my name's Michael O'Brien. I was one of the Cardiff newsagent three who was wrongly convicted of the murder of Philip Saunders in 1987.
Okay, now, what do you know about the case of Edith Thompson, Freddie Bywaters, and Edith's husband, Percy Thompson?
Well, what I do know is Edith Thompson didn't have a fair hearing and didn't have a fair trial. And I do know that there was evidence there to suggest that she did not try to kill her husband, like she mentioned in her letters. There was insinuations that she was trying to do it, like with the glass and everything. But then when the expert looked at that, on the pathology, it doesn't add up. There is nothing there. So if there is nothing there, on what basis did they say she was trying to kill her husband? I mean, she cannot be responsible for what her lover did. But it seems to me like it was a joint enterprise as far as they were concerned. And I think that's what caused a miscarriage of justice.
This case is actually 100 years ago tomorrow that Edith Thompson and Freddie Bywaters were hanged for the murder of Percy Thompson. There is absolutely no doubt that Freddie Bywaters is the person who killed Percy Thompson. He agrees with this. But he also said several times that Edith didn't have anything to do with it and that she didn't know about it. And the reactions at the time indicate that she didn't know about it and she tried to get him to stop. However, she does lead them in the police in the wrong direction to start with, but it becomes very clear when they find out about the letters that that is what actually led to Bywaters and eventually back to Edith. So the key thing about this, as you mentioned, was the pathology. And in this particular case, you have the preeminent expert of forensic pathology, not even at the time, but you could say of all time, probably the most famous and expert pathologist, forensic pathologist, that is, Professor Sir Bernard Spilsbury. And this is one of the few cases where you have a jury ignoring the evidence of Bernard Spilsbury. Spilsbury said there in the pathology, and there was an expert who supported him as well, there is no evidence of any glass in the victim, and there is no evidence of poison. These were the two methods that Edith Thompson's letters said she had tried to kill Percy Thompson. So clearly she didn't.
I feel, they've gone against the pathology evidence, which, proves that she didn't do it. And the fact is, where is the evidence to suggest she encouraged the lover, cooperating evidence, if you like, or any evidence for that matter, to say that her husband, her boyfriend was, she encouraged him to do it. There wasn't anything there. And the only thing which got her convicted, by the sounds of it, from what I can see, is the morals of the time. That it was frowned upon if you were married to have an affair. It was frowned upon if you married a black person in those days as well, which will lead us on to the other case later on. Yes, I think a big miscarriage of justice has been done here. The fact remains is, what can we do about it now, and how has it affected all her family over the years? Is there any living relatives still alive? Is there any descendants, sort of thing? And if there is, what can we do to rectify the matter? Because obviously she paid the ultimate price for something she didn't do. So it's like Mahmoud Matan, and many other cases, Timothy Evans. The only thing you can do is try and get an apology from the government. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yes, I would add that in the 100 years since her execution, there have been attempts to highlight her case, but it hasn't been dealt with by the CCRC. It hasn't been referred back to the Court of Appeal. And it's one of these cases where there really wasn't a great deal of evidence. What there was is public disapproval of her morals. She was 29 years old. He was 20 years old. And it was seen that, strangely, the public sympathy was for him, Freddie Bywaters. He was basically seen as young lad that was under the influence of an older woman, and she's the one who has all these bad morals and bad character. She led him astray, poor Freddie. That's not even what, how Freddie sees it himself. He did love her, there's no doubt about it, and in her way she loved him as well. But she was actually dubbed, and I quote, the Messalina of Ilford, the wife of the Emperor Claudius. And she was deemed to have absolutely no morals whatsoever. She was essentially seen as a sex-obsessed megalomaniac who had power and was finally caught and executed. They basically say, by dubbing Edith Thompson the Messalina of Ilford, that is a comment on her morals. And the point about it is, when you look at this case, what evidence is there? In terms of murder, no, there isn't any. The only way you could have got Edith Thompson was through joint enterprise. I'm essentially saying she's the one who set it up. She's the one who led Freddie Bywaters astray. She's the one who's ultimately responsible. Because you could look at this, and despite the sympathy you'd have with Bywaters for whatever reason, you had to go down the route that you went if you wanted to get Edith Thompson. And publicly they did. Because the other thing that is interesting about this is there had not been an execution of a woman since 1907. And the last execution before Edith Thompson of a woman was of a baby farmer in 1907. So that's essentially saying they very, very rarely do the ultimate punishment for women. It's a thing that you can see all over the world. There's an absolute disproportionate sort of tally of executed women compared to men. So it doesn't happen a lot. Yet in this particular case, it happens when you have very, very little evidence. And it couldn't have happened if it wasn't for joint enterprise. How do you think that needs to be dealt with?
Well, I think that even now there should be an investigation into the case. It's never too late to learn lessons. But one thing I have picked up on is the fact that the media seems to have vilified this Edith Thompson and turned the public against her, I would imagine, as well. And I mean, you can't have executions based on what the media think or what the public think. It's got to be based on evidence. And if it was based on evidence, there was nothing to suggest that she took part in her husband's killing. So therefore, it needs to be referred back to the CCRC. It needs to go back to the Court of Appeal. And I know there's arguments like I've heard in the Dick Penderyn case where, with the Merthyr Uprising, for people who don't know that case, he was a man who was executed in 1831. And what they did with him was they had no evidence against him, but because he was the ringleader, they executed him. And there was very little evidence, as you know yourself, Satish, on that particular case. And the CCRC is saying at the moment that because there's no existing relatives, it doesn't matter whether he was innocent or not. And I find that extraordinary. And I just hope they don't do that in Edith Thompson's case, because there's a possibility that that could be the case. And that is something else that should be challenged.
Well, as we sort of mentioned in terms of joint enterprise, it's actually quite interesting that there's massive campaigns about the use of joint enterprise now, and even in other cases, such as Derek Bentley and Christopher Craig, where it's highlighted and it's the controversial use of it. But this one seems to have slipped under the radar.
It has, and I think that's due to the passage of time, sadly. You know what I mean? But I think it's time to resurrect it, because I think it would be a good starting point to get, we know joint enterprise is unfair. I wouldn't say there's thousands and thousands of cases, but I would say that there's a number of cases which cause me great concern, in today's cases. where people are being done by joint enterprise, and that is very worrying, and something does need to be done about it. And if this case can play a significant part in opening up the door to getting the joint enterprise reformed, then we must try and do that, because it's very significant.
You alluded to this other case, and that was the murder at the Savoy Hotel on July 10th, 1923, of Prince Ali Fahmy. The person responsible for it was his wife, Marguerite Fahmy. She used to be known as Marguerite Alibert. Their relationship was tempestuous on both sides, but she shot him 3 times. The police were eventually called, and she was taken to prison on remand, and she then managed to get letters out, which was essentially saying that she had had a relationship when she was working as a courtesan with during World War One with then Prince Edward, who later became King Edward VIII. These letters included his opinions about military matters. Bear in mind, we're talking about during the Great War, and also his opinions of the royal family. This wasn't the sort of information that the authorities wanted in the public domain. So it was said very, very firmly that she blackmailed the British authorities into getting her off, that they could put her on trial, because there was no choice, you had to put her on trial. And you also had the second part of this, which is the defense, which was led by one of the great barristers at the time, Sir Edward Marshall Hall, King's Counsel, whose defense of her was this poor white woman has been victimized and treated so badly by her husband, this foreigner who was an Egyptian prince at the time, and that she had acted in self-defense. So essentially what happened is Edward Marshall Hall was able to put the victim, Ali Fahmy, on trial instead of his client, and she got acquitted. So where all of this comes from is, one, you have absolutely deplorable tactics during the trial by the defense, and you have a situation of where clear racism has taken place, but you also have this issue of, well, if you're going to denounce the morals of Edith Thompson and hang her because you don't like her morals, what about this?
Well, I think that raises contrasting issues, Satish, because at the end of the day, this woman who killed her husband has got away with murder. That is a miscarriage of justice as well. And we must recognise that there are guilty people, unfortunately, especially in those times, who did get off with crimes which they did do, and still do today. I think we mustn't ever forget that. But in that particular case, the morals of this woman to use the letters, I mean, today she wouldn't get away with it because there's the Blackmail Act, which was brought out, a few years after this case, which was in 1936. And, she would have been on further charges, and she would have been hung if those laws would have been applicable at that particular time. But I mean, it goes to show, that the judiciary can be manipulated to do whatever it needs to be done. And if it means stopping scandals from coming out and people being acquitted, this is a classic case, isn't it? And I mean, we mustn't forget that the victim here, he's been vilified. That wouldn't be allowed today. So, that case should be revisited. And if there is evidence, for whatever reason, which points to a miscarriage of justice, the double jeopardy rule is gone now. So therefore, surely, if there is evidence to point that she killed him in cold blood, even today, would she be held accountable? You know, by today's standards, what would your, you know, even though she's not around anymore, she's probably gone. But I mean,
Yeah,
on
she's dead.
paper, yeah, I'm on about on paper now. Would she still be, you know, people be able to point the finger and say, well, yeah, she did. This was a miscarriage of justice. The prince did get a wrong, you know, wrongly accused of race. You know, all the stuff which she said about him and everything. I can imagine what the paper said at the time, because um, racism was really bad in those days. You know what I mean? We know that. I mean, I'll give you an example. You know, even in the 50s, if a white person married a black person or went with a black person, it was frowned upon. I know that from my own family. You know, my mother was white, my father was Maltese, and her family basically washed their hands of her because she married a Maltese guy. It was not the done thing. So in the 20s and 30s, you can imagine the hysteria about all that. So you've got to take all that, you know, the era of the times as well. Definitely.
The other significant thing about it is that Prince Ali Fahmy was considerably younger than Marguerite Fahmy. So you look at this, look at her history, look at what was actually done, and then compare it with the Edith Thompson thing, and you say, where's the moral outrage? If you are going to condemn Edith Thompson, this is 10 times worse.
Well, why wasn't she condemned? She should have been. And although I don't believe in the death penalty, you know what I mean, you know, for obvious reasons, because of miscarriages of justice, this woman should have been in prison for a very, very, very long time. There was no evidence that what she was saying was true, that she, you know, he mistreated her or whatever. I know there was certain things on both sides, probably, as in all relationships, but she pulled the trigger, Satish, and she's got to take responsibility. And she didn't take responsibility, and she was allowed to get away with it. That's very concerning, because if that happened today, there would be an outrage over it. So why wasn't it outrage at the time? I mean, I find that very astonishing.
Well, this is the whole point with it. The contrasting cases, you have everything they use to condemn Edith Thompson is much, much worse than the other case. And yet, the worst one is given the assistance to get off, to not just get away with murder. It actually gets even worse. She managed to sue for part of Ali Fahmy's estate as well. So she actually got access, you know, to his money after she murdered him.
So she benefited from the crime.
Yeah. But it was much later. It was essentially, she benefited as his widow. But the only reason she was his widow is she killed him.
Well, that is just outrageous case. And, you know, I just feel that's a further injustice to the family. And yes, the British government should apologize to the prince and, you know, the Egyptian authorities, because it's wrong what's gone on here. Definitely on two fronts. One, she's got away with murder, and then she's taking his money afterwards. I mean, wow. If that was to happen now, it wouldn't happen. This is the thing, you know, there's things in place to stop you from gaining from crimes. So I just think it's outrageous. And if her living relatives are around and they've inherited that money should be returned to the family, to the prince's family. I really do.
What would you like to add, if anything, in relation to both of these cases? But you know, the Edith Thompson case and also Ali Fahmy.
I think that both of them should be reopened. I really do, Satish, and looked at again. And in my opinion, there's no difference. A miscarriage is a miscarriage of justice. Whether somebody is guilty and got away with it, that is a miscarriage of justice. And somebody who's been wrongly hung, that's a miscarriage of justice. And you've got to look at it from that point of view. There is many forms of miscarriages of justices in those cases, which I've just tried to explain. And what you've got to look at is, what can we learn from these things? What can we, you hear the call for the death penalty on a regular basis over here. I mean, that would be ludicrous to even think of bringing it back. But that's that's for another day. But going to these two cases, apologies need to be established and innocence needs to be established in the Edith Thompson case, and apologies all round. Okay, there's not else we can do because he paid the ultimate price. But like Timothy Evans, his family, and like Mahmoud Matan's family, the people which are left behind and who have been devastated by this, the grandchildren, the great-great-grandchildren, and so forth, the descendants, it's in their interests to have that conviction overturned. In Edith Thompson's case. Now, going back to the other case which you mentioned, which the person was guilty of killing, why should she benefit from that crime? Why should she get away with that? That is outrageous. Why haven't the British government apologized to the Egyptian government for that? That should have been done many years ago. It's not too late. Not too late, but it needs to be rectified. And the only way you're going to rectify it is if the case is reopened and looked at by today's standards and by today's laws, and whether that would be acceptable today. I think that's the only way we can go forward with that. I don't know what your opinions are. I'd appreciate what you got to say on that one, but I do think you've got to go by today's standards, and she wouldn't get away with it.
I would say these two cases, I linked them for a reason, and it is clear that it was to do with the contrast in the treatment of Edith Thompson and Marguerite Fahmy. When, if you want to talk about morals and say that Edith Thompson's morals were lacking, you can say that if you really want to, but you cannot compare her morals with Marguerite Fahmy's. You just can't.
No, they're in stark contrast. I mean, how anyone had any sympathy for the one who killed the prince is just unbelievable. How could anybody want to help her? I don't agree with the death penalty. As I said, I wouldn't want her to have been executed, but she should have been in prison for life. She deserved that.
Yeah, her case, the reason she got away with it is, one, she had the highly embarrassing letters from the then Prince of Wales, Prince Edward, later King Edward VIII, and two, she played race card. She played the I'm a poor white woman treated abominably by this beastly foreigner, save me. And she got away with it. That was how she did it. Because if you had, let's say, if Prince Fahmy hadn't been Egyptian and foreign, but had been white, would they have been able to get away with it, even with the letters?
No, I don't think they would have. But because of in those days, as I explained, you know what I mean, it was bad enough in the 50s and the 60s. And I know that from my own family. But going back in those days, and if you have a look at the history, I mean, it was something else. Do you know what I mean? The racism was really at its peak, if you like. So yeah, I can see how she managed to manipulate and do these things, but it needs to be looked at, Satish, by today's standards. Would she have got away with it today? What is your opinion? Do you think she would have got away with it if she was on trial today?
It depends how you sort of do it, how you were actually able to present the defense. I mean, we've all seen there are some cases where you look at the verdict and you just think, how on earth? How did that verdict get reached? It just doesn't make any sense. And what she did in playing the race card, yeah, you could do it again. But it actually depends on the performance of the lawyers as well, and also how society reacts to it. Because it's easy to believe things if you're only getting a limited source of information. So if you put it in terms of, like, yes, she shot her husband, but she did it in self-defense because he had been violent towards her. He had done this towards her. And you turn it around so the victim becomes the perpetrator. Then, yeah, it can still happen. And it has.
Well, that's the worrying thingy, because We need to learn lessons from all these cases to stop it from happening again. Why do you think this government do not learn any lessons, Satish? Because that's a valid question, which a lot of people would like to know. Why haven't they learned any lessons from the past? And why are they still rearing this ugly head with some of these cases like the one you just mentioned? Surely in 2023, these things are a thing of the past, people would say. But as you rightly point out, they're not. So what do you suggest we do going forward?
Well, you know, for a long time, I've always been saying you look at various cases to see what they can teach you, and you have a Truth and Justice Commission or whatever you want to call it, so that you learn the lessons of these cases, not just because people have been treated badly and have suffered injustice, but if you want to make changes so that you don't repeat the same mistakes, you have to know what the mistakes are. And how can you know what the mistakes are if you don't actually look into these cases and find out? That's part of the lessons of it. One of these things is those two cases should be a very, very, very strong warning. Do not judge people because you disapprove of their morals. You judge them on the basis of the evidence. They can have horrible morals and still be innocent of these particular crimes, and they can actually have wonderful morals but have committed a crime. The key fact is, what does the evidence say? Not what their beliefs are, not what their morals are and how they live their lives. It's not important. What is important is, what does the evidence say? So essentially, what I would say on this is, until you have a proper evidence-based criminal justice system where it is only about what the evidence is saying and can show, you will always have injustice.
The other point is, Satish, as well, which I feel is quite strong. Until we get accountability in this country, we will always have some kind of injustices. No matter what you say or do, there's always going to be somebody who's going to slip through the net, and when they do slip through the net, it's going to be a bad one. Like like all the other cases which have gone on. I don't think. I don't know what you think about this, about the miscarriages of justice which are happening in today in 2023, but I don't think it was as bad as, like, say, 1923. Do you know what I mean? Some lessons have obviously been learned, but there's still a lot to learn. And until we rectify these matters, as you rightly point out, and I'm in agreement with you, we will always have miscarriages. But accountability has to be another thing on the agenda when they, for Edith Thompson's death. People should have been, I know it's too late now because it's over 100 years ago, but recommendations can be still made so this can never happen again to anybody else, surely. Well, what are your thoughts on
that? The thing with this is that when Edith Thompson believed that she was going to be reprieved and that she was going to win an appeal, just a few days before she was due to be executed, she was told, no, you are going to be executed. And she completely fell apart and went to pieces. She wasn't able to cope with it. Even at the time of her execution, she needed support. They had to take her up to help her onto the gallows and the rest of it. She was absolutely in pieces when they executed her. It's bad enough what was done to her, but another thing that happened with this is it deeply affected the hangman, John Ellis. I don't know if you know about Ellis, but he actually he lost his job as a hangman because he tried to commit suicide, which was actually a criminal offense at the time he tried to do it. And he had to basically promise the judge that he was never going to commit suicide again or try to commit suicide. And the end result is he went on the road, sort of taking his story as a hangman in theatres and things like that. He then got stopped and he ended up getting worse and worse. And eventually he tried to kill his family, failed, and committed suicide. one of the things that was said about him is that it deeply affected him. He absolutely hated hanging women in particular. And this one really, really affected him badly. So that's another side of it, because which is not really looked at, which is what is the effect on the executioner.
Well, yeah, and I think the other thing, it should put the death knell in anything to do with the death penalty in this country. I am fed up of hearing people going, as soon as there's an atrocity, let's hang them high. And I think to myself, you know, in this day and age, why isn't there more compassion? Why, you know, put them in prison, yeah, by all means. But this death penalty and bloodthirstiness, which is still here, we're supposed to be a civilized society. Well, what's civilized about the death penalty? Where we were saying about the two cases that Edith Thompson and,
Yeah,
you know, I don't know
Marguerite,
what.
Fahmy.
Yeah, it's all right. Since I got distracted, then like my
Yeah.
phone
But I
call
mean,
through.
one of the things you could say about it is they did have the death penalty, and it would at that time. And the end result of it is the innocent one is executed, the guilty one gets off.
Yeah, I think they're very exceptional cases. You know what I mean? In the sense, like, you know, going back to the, you know, the era of the time, and because of the, you know, the moral issues and everything, I think they should be looked at again. They should be looked at again. And if Edith Thompson, if there is enough evidence there to suggest that she is innocent, which it seems that way with the expert, I mean, you can't argue with the pathologist, right? I mean, you know, he knows what he's doing. You know, if that was today, would somebody be sent to prison for that, life imprisonment? If
The
you had an
only
expert,
way you could send her to prison or somebody like that to prison then and now is through joint enterprise. There was no way you could get a murder conviction on her, as saying that she actually committed the murder, because she didn't. And there was never any argument that it was Freddie Bywaters who committed the murder. The only way you could actually bring Edith Thompson into it, and they really were desperate to do that, was through joint enterprise.
yeah, well, that needs to be looked at. Maybe they should be using this case as why joint enterprise should be looked at. But as I said, Satish, I don't think, you know, I know about joint enterprise like most of us do, but I don't think there is as many cases as what these organizations are saying on joint enterprise. Because if you were there and you did nothing to stop the person or even try, what do you do then? Do you convict that person of joint enterprise? I would argue that yes, they should. If they'd done nothing to stop it and they went along there and there was an agreement that, you know, if you go and do a robbery with somebody, like a burglary, and you go into that house and you know there's people upstairs asleep, you know if they wake up, there's a chance you're going to have to use violence because that's the only way you're going to escape. What do you do then? You know what I mean? So the joint enterprise is not, you know, there's a lot of controversial issues which need to be looked at. But, you know, I don't think there's as many cases as what they're making out. You know, I don't know what the statistics are. Have you got any ideas? What is
No,
alleged?
but I mean, you also have to be aware of there is a difference between joint enterprise and accomplice. And so, you know, this isn't, this was basically a joint enterprise case. She wasn't, you know, committing the crime with him or anything. So it's not an accomplice one. This is a straight issue of joint enterprise.
Well, it's obviously not, is it? We know that. There's no joint enterprise.
Yeah.
What do you know, I just wanted to get you on the big debate because you were talking about joint enterprise, and I only want to touch upon it. I'm of the view, if you go on a robbery and somebody is killed, then I'm sorry, if you do nothing to try and stop it, and you know full well that there's people in that house, and that if they woke up, what was going to happen, and somebody dies, even if that third person never even touched that person, do you think they should be found guilty of murder?
It depends. If they knew about the weapon, then yes. in advance. But if they didn't know about the weapon, then you don't have your joint enterprise of that is to go and commit a robbery. It's not to go and shoot somebody, in the course of the robbery.
What about
So you
foresight?
should be convicted of the armed robbery, having been there and having the joint enterprise to commit the armed robbery. But if you didn't know that the person had a weapon, then where's the evidence that you actually had a joint enterprise to kill?
Okay, I'll give you another example, and this is a true case. This is two people when had a history of doing burglaries. You know, they must have known at one stage that somebody was going to wake up. The guy gets punched by the one, the other one runs out and does nothing. Does he get convicted of joint enterprise? Or does he get done for just the burglary or the robbery?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? The actual
Right.
case.
Yeah, there's two people who have done numerous burglaries, so they're well familiar with the situation. But on the last occasion, somebody wakes up, right, and one of the defendants punches the guy in the face. He dies, and the other one has run out, like, and say, well, just run out and not even touch the guy. Should he get done for murder?
No.
Why?
Because you couldn't know that a punch was going to kill. And you didn't know that the person was going to, before you commit the crime, the agreement to commit the crime is commit robbery. You don't know that the person's punch was going to kill. It's impossible to know that.
Or what about the foresight rule?
The foresight?
Yeah, foresight. If you do a number of burglaries, the chances are somebody's going to wake up or you're going to disturb somebody.
Yeah, but
you're going to have to
use the point is, would you have known that one punch would kill from your partner in crime?
But the fact is, he shouldn't have been there.
No, he shouldn't have been there, but that's why you do them for the robbery. You do them for the crime they've actually committed, which is the robbery.
Oh, I got slight different opinions on you on that one, Sati.
Fair enough.
We have to agree to disagree, but I just wanted to know your views. Yeah, I just wanted to know your views on that. But going back to Edith Thompson, I think it's clear there was no joint enterprise, and that's why I think she's got a good case to get it reopened. And is there any living relatives? Do we know about Satish? Have you?
There's certainly a number of books that have been written about it. One very recent. There's a couple of podcasts and stuff like that, which I've sent you a link to, at least one of them. So there are people who are looking into it. She didn't have children, which is another thing that went against her in terms of the times. So you won't have direct relatives, but you may well have nieces, down the line of the siblings. So there may well be relatives like that. Then you also have the husband who isn't going to, his relatives, you don't know what they think on this. And you'd also have Bywaters' relatives potentially, because he did say very, very clearly on a number of occasions she didn't know anything about it. She didn't plan it. She didn't do it.
Well, that's why it's extraordinary. She was convicted on such flimsy evidence of those letters. When the pathology went against what she said.
Yeah.
That's extraordinary. So, that does need to be looked at. I don't know how the CCRC would take this. It'd be very interesting to follow this going through the CCRC and the Court of Appeal. Whether it makes that progression, I don't know. But I think personally, it doesn't matter whether it's 200 years. If somebody is innocent, like Edith, if somebody is innocent, whether there's any living relatives alive, it shouldn't matter. It's the decent thing to do, to clear somebody's name and say, if they've got to give them a pardon, so be it. But that's the decent thing to do. You can't say, well, like they've done in Dick Pentonville, oh, it was 1823. Nah, don't worry about that. Or 1831, it doesn't matter about that because he's got no living relatives. I mean, I find that quite shocking, to and hard to take, because everybody in Wales knows that Dick Penderyn is innocent.
Yeah.
Everybody. So why not do the decent thing?
But it's down to the CCRC. It's got to refer it back. And the same with Edith Thompson. You've got to refer it back. But the problem is the evidence, because there was so little evidence, proper credible evidence in the first place, it's very, very difficult to get things overturned. If there's plenty of evidence, you've got a lot of opportunity to do it. But if there isn't, it's, you have to deal with something completely different.
Yeah. Well, let's leave it there and let's see what happens. It'd be nice to see if some progression could be made. But I do hope people come forward in the sense, like, who want to take the case forward. Maybe there's a good solicitor out there who's going to look at this case, and maybe, like Bernard DeMay did with Mohammed Matan's case, could get it referred. You don't know, and let's hope that will happen.
Yep, let's hope so.
Well, let's just remember Edith Thompson as a victim of a miscarriage of justice, and tomorrow maybe people can think about that, because it is one to think about, and innocent people shouldn't be forgotten. And I'd like to just leave on that note. It's an important day tomorrow for miscarriages of justices, and one to remember.